All right, this is part 2 of the paper on moral relativism and Ruth Benedict. Aristotle, human flourishing, and justice as rule for the well-being of the ruled. The notion of human well-being, or human flourishing, allows for variability, but within a range of possibilities. I agree with Benedict that human nature is very plastic and admits of a huge range of possibilities. But this does not lead to the conclusion that all possibilities are equally legitimate. Although the position I'm promoting here is one I learned from reading Aristotle, Aristotle would himself not want anyone to believe it because he said it. Rather, it's a generic position promoted in various forms by many thinkers and leaders, and I've also argued the United Nations capabilities approach is very similar. On this view, a society is just when those with power and privilege use their advantages to promote the well-being of everyone in the society. Power and privilege apply to every human relationship: parents and children, teachers and students, religious leaders and followers, employers and employees, political leaders at all levels of political life, from local to national to international, and citizens who are asked to abide by the laws, policies, and judgments of those with power. Each society varies and changes over time in relation to what kind of life citizens live and the level of prosperity their society can provide. A society is unjust when those with privilege, power, wealth, and status deliberately take more of those social goods for themselves and their families or friends at the expense of others. Abuses of power are not only morally wrong, they're also ultimately self-destructive. They create social instability because they destroy trust and goodwill between citizens. When the ruled in any relationship that involves authority no longer believe that those with power are using it to help them, they are more likely to disobey, to ignore legitimate expectations, and even to revolt against leaders they consider corrupt. Just leaders tend to retain power and to leave behind a legacy of well-being for their families, friends, and societies. Unjust leadership tends to have the opposite effect. One aspect of ruling for the well-being of all the citizens involves how natural resources are allocated and used. In a just society, the powerful create laws, institutions, and promote ways of living that are most likely to lead to the preservation of natural resources over time. This standard applies to the most primitive as well as the most complex societies, using Benedict's distinctions. In the case of the paranoid tribe in Benedict's examples, the yam seeds are by far the most important natural resource. They must be preserved from one growing season to the next. That is why everyone protects his own to a degree that seems unnatural to Westerners. Although the examples appears aberrant to us, a closer examination of the example seems to indicate the society was just according to Aristotle's criteria. Even though the yam seeds determine life or death, Benedict does not say that the leaders are allowed to steal from those with less power. Rather, we're under the impression that everyone is equally responsible for protecting their seeds and no one is allowed to take from anyone else. Many supposedly more developed nations are far less just than this. The institution of slavery, for example, for the purpose of economic prosperity, was clearly an unjust way of organizing a society, even though many slaves were conditioned to accept it and did not question it. Today, the wealthier nations are taking the natural resources from so-called developing nations at a rate that is unsustainable. The rich and powerful create the laws and institutions that allow and even promote such behavior, although it could just as easily be called unjust theft on a global scale. This is just one example of many ways in which Westerners and those in so-called developed nations should not assume their culture is better or more evolved than members of some so-called primitive, isolated tribes or citizens in underdeveloped nations. Benedict is correct to criticize Western bigotry that claims the West is better or best, but I disagree with her reason for making this claim. The reason the West is not better is not because all morality is relative and the West is no better or worse than any other culture. Rather, the reason the West is not better is because the culture is focused on defining human flourishing as based on material prosperity. Further, Westerners have been conditioned to become prosperous through the excessive and, at this point, the self destructive exploitation of natural resources. Benedict discusses, quote, the normality of such behavior patterns as acquisitiveness, unquote, in the West, but does not argue that a culture that conditions its citizens to be acquisitive is any better or worse than a society that molds people to conform to the behaviors in her four examples. Rather, her point is, quote, most individuals are plastic to the molding force of the society into which they are born. In a society that sets the gathering of possessions as the chief human objective, citizens will amass property, unquote. Aristotle, among others, argued that the desire for more than one share of any kind of limited resource, whether material goods or power or status, is a great threat to social stability and human well-being. When citizens are driven by that desire, those with privilege will be able to amass more, leading to a larger and larger gap between the rich and the poor. This will lead to animosity and instability. There are many examples of great inequality that may seem to undermine this position. Benedict's example of the tribal chief who can kill others when one of his family members is killed while no one else can might seem to be the chief's desire for more power than he deserves. One should argue, however, that the degree of inequality is not the issue. There's a good reason for this custom, as I have pointed out. Even in that case, the chief could overstep his privilege and kill too many people, or kill arbitrarily whenever he likes, not just when his family members are killed. At some point, such killing would probably lead to social unrest and instability. Most societies in human history have been based on large inequalities between leaders and citizens. Citizens accepted the situation because they were molded to accept it. Aristotle is not talking about the unequal distribution of social resources. He's referring to an insatiable desire for more and more of the social goods. When this desire becomes prominent in a society, the social fabric unravels. At some point, either the corrupt leadership leads to destruction, or citizens choose to reject what has been going on in the past. Whether they are conscious of why they choose change, abuses of power usually lead to the deterioration of the quality of life. When the quality of life declines, citizens usually become afraid or angry and are then motivated to change. Today, we know that the West, especially the United States, is deliberately promoting acquisitiveness as the means to overall well-being, both within the United States and around the world. So-called development is assumed to mean economic development and higher levels of wealth in the so-called underdeveloped nations. There are many reasons to argue against this position. Our collective use of natural resources to the point of destroying ourselves and the natural world as we know it is one obvious reason. The creation of animosity between nations, wars for resources, and animosity within nations are other reasons for arguing against acquisitiveness as the goal of human life. On this view, leaders at all levels are ruling for the well-being of the ruled when they give citizens the opportunity to become wealthier. The accumulation of wealth could be at the expense of time for family, friends, education, health, or any other human goods. Okay, so leaders who cultivate acquisitiveness are not promoting the well-being of their citizens over time in the long run. This does not mean citizens should not be motivated to become prosperous either. Aristotle simply points out that citizens should be taught from childhood to behave in ways that promote everyone's well-being, their capacity to flourish. Adults who go into the economic sector of society and get wealthy would want to use their wealth to promote those activities that are valuable for their own sake, such as education, artistic endeavors, the creation of communities based on helping those in need, or other activities. We know from history and the study of tribal communities that human beings are not by nature motivated for material gain. We know that Western acquisitiveness is a result of cultural conditioning. Benedict, however, cannot criticize Western culture for its acquisitiveness as long as she adheres to her position of moral relativism. Aristotle and others, however, have always criticized such a foundation for society because it will not promote well-being over time. Today that criticism is more relevant than ever, especially because of the limiting conditions of natural resources and the more and more complex interactions between the world's nation-states. Many of the world's previously most isolated tribes have now been affected by the process of globalization. Each of these interferences in local cultures can be evaluated as better or worse, based on whether the changes being made are promoting the well-being of everyone involved, and not just helping rich people get richer. Aristotle argues that the best societies are meritocracies, societies where those with power are given the degree and type of power they have because they've shown their merit, their ability to exercise that kind of power to the degree they have it in the way that promotes human flourishing. Further, human beings are unequal in their ability to exercise power justly. The art of statesmanship requires the exercise of many types of human excellence, among them being 1. The ability to know what laws and institutions are most likely to lead to human flourishing. 2. The ability to recognize good advisors and surround themselves with people who will inform the leader and enable him or her to make good choices. 3. The ability to recognize just leaders and appoint them to positions of political leadership. 4. The ability to persuade the people that this is indeed the best possible way of organizing the political sphere of life, so as to promote everyone's well-being. 5th, the ability to assess threats to national security and to engage in negotiated settlements rather than war whenever possible. 6th, the ability to set up trade agreements, security agreements, and other bonds between their nations and other nations in a way that promotes everyone's well-being, so that everyone gains from preserving peace, trust, and goodwill between nations. Not everyone is qualified to exercise political authority because it's very difficult and complex. Certainly the members of Benedict's so-called primitive tribes are not necessarily conscious of all these levels of human interaction. Benedict chose isolated tribes precisely because they have very simple and unchanging ways of living. But even considering the different levels of complexity, the tribes have to deal with these issues, and the tribes thrive if they do so, if they have leaders who rule for the well-being of the ruled. On Aristotle's view, a society is not just or unjust because it's structured as a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy. It's not just or unjust if it's a complex or a simple tribe. Rather, a society is just when rulers rule for the sake of the ruled, and it's unjust when rulers rule for the sake of the rulers. A society cannot be described as just simply because its political leaders are elected or because the laws officially allow citizens to make their own choices about what kind of work they want to do and all the conditions related to their work environments. If the vast majority of citizens do not have enough money or influence to start their own businesses, and there are no laws to protect the conditions of work, they will be forced to do whatever those with power require. In a corrupt democracy, citizens promote only those laws and institutions that promote their personal or family or professional interests without any concern for the well-being of others. In a corrupt democracy, elected political leaders can be forced to use their power to promote the interests of the powerful, whether the rich or the military or another group, in order to retain their power. Aristotle is also keenly aware of the role that personal virtues and vices play in the ability of individuals and cultures to survive. The personal character traits are also connected to the problem of human ignorance and the way societies fall apart because of different kinds and degrees of ignorance. Our vices tend to make us ignore what we need to know to act well. Even people with good intentions often do not have access to what they need to know to make good choices. Even the best choice in a given situation can have a bad outcome because of extenuating circumstances or bad luck. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics describes so many virtues and vices that it becomes clear how easily anyone can go wrong. By implication, Aristotle's ethical and political works make clear how easily even a society that is well integrated and consistent within itself could become maladaptive and either die out or flounder. Aristotle's discussion of the virtue of courage is one example of the complexity of human life and the continual effort of people to adapt to the situations around them in order to survive and to thrive. Courage is the human virtue in relation to situations involving fear. There are many, many kinds of situations that involve fear because human beings are vulnerable in many ways and have a lot to be afraid of. They fear for their ability to survive. They fear attacks from foreign enemies. They fear being harmed by their fellow citizens. They fear becoming ostracized and isolated. They fear pain, death, and many other threats to well-being. Aristotle defines cowardice as the inability to face such situations, which only makes the problems worse. The other extreme is becoming excessively aggressive, leading to an aggressive response, which creates more problems. A courageous person can respond correctly to situations involving fear, faces the problem, does what is most likely to solve it, and acts this way because it is the right thing to do, rather than because they want some external social reward. Obviously, these kinds of definitions require particular applications. We all know that people disagree, so we need to know if there's any way to use particular examples to show universal patterns of better and worse ways to act in situations involving fear. Returning to Benedict's examples, all four can be understood as reactions to fear. The obsession with protecting one's yam seeds is a response to the fear of starvation. Within the society, the man who becomes even more fearful and goes on a killing spree is at one extreme. The other extreme would be someone who was not fearful enough and allowed his yam seeds to rot or be stolen. Although it seems like an overreaction to us, the custom has worked and for that reason is not likely to change. Headhunting in the society Benedict describes is also a practice that seems extreme to us, but seems to have worked to preserve social stability, and therefore is not likely to change. The fear that one's leader has no power to protect the citizens is a great and legitimate fear, and requires a very forceful response. The promotion of mystical states of mind is another way of coping with fear and vulnerability. People find inner strength as a way to avoid excess fear. The condemnation of homosexuality could also be at least partly associated with fear. The fear that if homosexuals are accepted, they will not have children and the society will not grow and thrive. Homosexuality was accepted in those societies where this fear did not exist, and where the opposite problem was feared instead. People feared that too many people would lead to an internal struggle for resources and the failure to thrive. On a more general level, fear is a natural emotional response when people feel threatened, when they think they will not survive. A culture is not stable simply because it is well integrated and consistent within itself. Rather, one reason a culture is stable is because it is well adapted to the external circumstances, including natural resources and the other human groups nearby. When a society is not well adapted to these external threats, fear will increase and the society will lose its internal integration and consistency. A culture is also not stable because it is well integrated and consistent within itself, in the sense that everyone acts the same way and learns to live by imitation and habit. The standardization of habits within a society might make a culture unable to adapt when the circumstances change. Living by imitation and habit alone can lead to destruction rather than to stability. Next section. The United universal standards of truth, justice, and virtue today, moral relativism, the United Nations capabilities approach to human development, and women's role. One could argue that in the past, Westerners claimed to know universal standards of good and evil, justice and injustice, for the sole purpose of justifying their unjust colonization of the world. But today, the rejection of any universal patterns and standards can also be used by the West to justify retaining its power, or getting rich, or creating economic control over the developing countries. If there are no universal standards, then powerful Westerners can maintain and increase their power because doing so is not morally wrong. When people are outraged at Western domination, their outrage has to be based on a universal standard of justice and injustice. They have to believe that we have a common human nature and human condition, and therefore deserve to be treated and to treat others in ways that promote everyone's well-being. The rejection of any universal standards makes it impossible to establish international standards that will control the process of global development today. The acceptance of universal standards, even when those standards were developed by the West, does not necessarily mean that the standards will be abused to justify and retain Western power over the developing nations. Instead, the models developed in the West can be used to expose the corruption and injustices of Western colonization in the past. Even though some colonizers might have had good intentions, and others might not have even known about the kind of oppression indigenous people were subjected to, the universal standards first formulated by the West can be legitimately used to criticize Western culture. Western so-called values can be used to demand that Westerners relinquish their power and privilege. Westerners have been and continue to be unjust because their culture has been based on lies that they've told themselves about how they've treated and continue to treat non-Westerners. The United Nations was founded on the Western ideology of human rights. Its Universal Declaration of Human Rights claims that all human beings are equal in dignity and rights, and lists the number of rights that all human beings supposedly possess by virtue of being human. The notion of human rights was invented by the West and is rejected by many other cultural traditions. For these reasons, the United Nations actually uses another model, the human capabilities approach, to evaluate each nation every year as moving in the direction of being a more just or a less just society. The capabilities listed are the activities of human beings need to engage in order to be fully human. The most basic capabilities are those we share with other animals. The more complex capabilities are unique to human beings, but are still necessary for a human being to be actively exercising its natural way of flourishing as a member of the human species. In her book, Women in Economic Development, Martha Nussbaum presents one version of the list of the human capabilities. As a professional Aristotle scholar, she noticed that this list is very similar to Aristotle's view of a flourishing human life, one in which all the natural powers of soul are active. Here's a summary of the list. Central human functional capabilities. Life, being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length. Bodily health, being able to have good health. Being adequately nourished and having shelter. Bodily integrity, being able to move freely from place to place. Having one's bodily boundaries treated as sovereign. Being able to be secure against assault, child abuse, and domestic violence, having opportunities for sexual satisfaction, and for choice in matters of reproduction, senses, imagination, and thought, being able to use the sense to imagine, think, and reason, and to do these things in a truly human way, in a way informed and cultivated by an adequate education, being able to use one's mind in ways protected by guarantees of freedom of expression with respect to both political and artistic speech, and freedom of religious exercise, being able to have pleasurable experiences, and to avoid non-necessary pain. Emotions, being able to have attachments to things and people outside ourselves, to love those who love and care for us, to grieve at their absence, not having one's emotional development blighted by overwhelming fear and anxiety or by traumatic events of abuse or neglect. 6. Practical wisdom, being able to form a conception of the good and to engage in critical reflection about the planning of one's life. 7th, affiliation, being able to recognize and show concern for other human beings, having the capability for both justice and friendship, having the social basis of self-respect and non-humiliation, protections against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, caste, ethnicity, or natural origin. In work, being able to work as a human being. Other species, being able to live with concern for and in relation to animals, plants, and the world of nature. Play, being able to laugh, to play, to enjoy recreational activities. Last, control over one's environment. Political control, being able to participate effectively in political choices that governs one's life. Having the right to political participation, including free speech and association. Material control, being able to hold property in terms of real opportunity and having property rights on an equal basis. Unquote. Many people throughout the world disagree with this document for various reasons. They might disagree that a capability exists. They might think it is not the purpose of political leaders to promote everyone's capabilities or to promote everyone's equally. The document indicates, however, that human beings are engaged in the process of creating a global civilization based on a foundation of human nature. The document claims that we have a basic humanity and that leaders in all sectors of society have a responsibility to exercise their power in ways that promotes human well-being. The document claims that rulers who use their power to promote the flourishing of only a few are wicked and unjust. There's a natural foundation for virtue and justice, even if people disagree on many of the particulars, and even if many cultures are not designed with the goal of promoting individual citizens' human rights or human capabilities. It isn't consciously their goal. Further, the model can be used even when Western societies are guilty of violating the cultivation of capabilities in citizens of developing nations because of their desire to enrich their own citizens. The model is a starting point for conversation and for decision making. Further, on both models, the United Nations claim both human rights and capabilities. The United Nations claims that women have equal rights and that they should have equal access to opportunities to develop their natural capabilities. Many, even most societies today, reject those claims. Further, some people argue that even if women have equal capabilities, they should not be given equal opportunity to exercise all of them. It may be argued that if women are given equal opportunities, the rights and basic needs or capabilities of children and old people will be ignored. This still does not mean that morality is entirely arbitrary and that there are no universal standards. The universal standard for justice and injustice is the goal of maximizing human flourishing. The disagreements arise in determining what sort of laws, policies, customs, and behaviors ought to be considered normal and moral in order to achieve this goal. It is in fact true that women have to be denied the opportunity to develop their capabilities in order to ensure that children and old people will be able to exercise more basic capabilities. I'm saying, is it in fact true? You have to deny women in order to make sure children and old people are taken care of. Does this imply that women can never divorce, even when abused, because their children and elders will be left with no way to survive? Cultural practices and norms can be reassessed in the light of the standard of maximizing flourishing. This is, in fact, what the United Nations does. Each nation has to be evaluated according to its natural and historical context. The capacity to flourish among citizens can differ greatly from one society to the next and can change quickly and radically. There can be a huge variety of ways to promote human flourishing without renouncing flourishing as a universal standard by which to judge, and without becoming a moral relativist. Although Benedict claims that morality is relative, her life as a professional anthropologist in the USA in the 1930s indicates that she rejected what was considered normal and moral for women at that time. The position that women were intellectually as capable as men and should get PhDs was considered extreme and aberrant to most Americans at that time. Even though her parents or teachers might have encouraged her, they would have had to defy cultural norms and change laws or customs in order to get her access to higher education. Benedict herself was most likely exposed to, quote, all the conflicts to which all aberrants are always exposed, and most likely experienced the psychic dilemmas of the socially unavailable because of her so-called abnormal lifestyle. Such treatment might have motivated her to claim that all morality is relative and is simply a term for socially approved habits. Benedict was not well integrated into her own society. Her way of life undermined her society's internal consistency and integration. Rather than proving that morality is a convenient term for socially approved habits, Benedict's way of life and research proves that the belief that women were intellectually inferior to men was a lie. This false belief has existed in most human cultures. Benedict's life exposed the lie. The society Benedict grew up in was unjust because it molded people to live according to a lie about human nature and human capabilities. Benedict's life and work made a contribution to social evolution because it made clear that discrimination against women, especially discrimination on the false belief in the intellectual inequality of men and women, was always wrong. Even though it was ubiquitous in the history of humankind, it was still wrong. Therefore unjust. Ironically, while committed to doing anthropological research, that Benedict argued led inevitably to the conclusion that, quote, morality is a convenient term for socially approved habits, unquote. Benedict's way of life as a researcher demonstrated that morality is not relative. Rather, Benedict's life history shows that societies often prevent citizens from developing their natural capabilities for no good reason. This is unjust because those in power, in this case men, ruled for the well-being of the rulers, not for the well-being of the ruled, and they did so without any justification. It was an example of might makes right. According to a moral relativist, might does not make right. It makes what a society considers right, but it does not reflect any universal standard of right or wrong. In other words, yeah. All right, Aristotle, the United Nations, and Benedict's way of life all reject the view that might makes right. I mean, moral relativism is the view that might makes right. Further, the recognition of women's equal capabilities leads to a model of justice and injustice that will bring about the biggest change in social norms in all of human history. Benedict's life exposed the fact that over one-half of the human race has been unjustly oppressed. Now that this truth has been exposed, societies will have to change, and they are changing. The changes will come slowly, partly because of the power of habit and custom, partly because of the need for social stability during the process of change, and partly to cultivate the development of everyone's capabilities, and also partly because men use rhetoric to try to convince women that they are inferior. In the end, however, natural justice demands equal treatment of men and women in the process of promoting human flourishing. More generally, even though societies in the past have not been able or willing to promote the capabilities of their citizens, the cultivation of capabilities is still a universal standard for justice and is more likely than any other standard to lead a society to stability and flourishing over time. Moral relativism, systems thinking, and the relation between culture and nature. Besides being based on the truth about human capabilities, cultures need to be evaluated as better or worse in relation to the most recent models of the natural world given to us by the scientific community. In his book, The Systems View of the World, Ernst Laszlo presents one version of the model of reality being developed by scientists today. Scientists have rejected the modern paradigm of reality based on Newtonian physics and the scientific method. Benedict's moral relativism was based on this Newtonian empiricist view of the natural world and the human psyche. Many social scientists today reject that paradigm and have developed models of society that are on the system's view of nature, the human psyche, and culture. First, Laszlo explains that the process of evolution moves in a pattern and direction, from chaos to order, and from a larger number of less complex individuals to a smaller number of more complex ones. Quote, in evolution there's a progression from multiplicity and chaos to oneness and order. There's also a progressive development of complex multi-component individuals, few in number but more accomplished in behavior than the previous entities. Evolution does go one way rather than another, unquote. Next, evolution has moved from smaller, non-living entities to living beings that exist as members of species that all fit into a larger biosphere, and from there to the emergence of the human species and human culture, which Laszlo calls the supra-organic. Quote, because the patterns of development in all realms of nature are analogous, evolution appears to drive toward the superposition of system upon system in a continuous multi-level structure traversing the regions of the suborganic, the organic, and the supra-organic. Human culture is made up of a number of interconnected social systems. Social systems, like systems in nature, form holyarchies. These are multi-level, flexibly coordinated structures that act as wholes despite their complexity. There are many levels and yet there's integration, unquote. Laszlo introduces the notion of values of good and evil into our investigation of nature, nature and culture. During the Enlightenment, intellectuals very carefully separated the careful observation of facts, science and social science, from any claims about good or evil. Benedict's relativism also presupposes this split. In her argument, facts are tangible and observable. Values do not exist among non-human natural beings. They are created by human beings as part of their cultures in order to attain social integration. They're arbitrary, the result of a long history of accidents. For systems thinkers, all natural systems move toward the goal of more and more complexity within a context of order. Values are all those goals directly or indirectly connected to the ultimate goal of higher and higher levels of complexity and flourishing. Quote, values are goals which behavior strives to realize. Any activity which is oriented toward the accomplishment of some end is value-oriented activity. Nothing that pursues an end is value-free. Values exist within non-human natural systems. There's nothing in all the realms of natural systems which would be value-free when looked at from the vantage point of the systems themselves, unquote. Since scientists can observe natural systems at work, they can figure out the goals or values that a system is moving toward. Quote, objective value norms can be deduced directly from the contemporary systemic world picture. Unquote. Social scientists who have adopted the system's view of reality apply the same model to their study of human culture. They begin with the assumption that all human behavior is goal-driven, so each choice presupposes values. Instead of beginning by observing the great differences between cultures, they begin by observing common patterns among human cultures. Quote, contemporary cultural anthropologists are specifying a number of fundamental universal values shared by people everywhere. the same basic values of survival, mutual collaboration, the raising of children, the worship of transcendent entities, and avoidance of suffering, injustice, and pain are manifested in all cultures, albeit often in radically different ways. The surface forms differ, but the depth structures are analogous. The human being pursues his ends as a biological, social, and cultural being wherever he lives." Unquote. This is the kind of analysis I applied to Benedict's examples. The paranoia about yam seeds was one example of the behavior the tribe was conditioned to associate with survival. Headhunting was connected to tribal security, the affirmation of power of their chief to protect them from outsiders. The value of mystic trance was one kind of worship to transcendent deities that I argued was also connected to the ability of people in that place and time to avoid suffering and to thrive. The acceptance of homosexuality also occurs in communities where it's connected with the survival and well-being of the community. Laszlo agrees that human beings are plastic and have the power to create communities that aim to achieve the goal of human flourishing in many different ways. Quote, "There's no imperative attached to the cultural specification of these values." Unquote. Laszlo goes on to point out that if we do want to flourish, we must recognize that as a species we, quote, "remain within the limits of general natural systems values." Although on the one hand we can choose according to our insights, unquote, we must recognize our natural limits. He points out that during the Enlightenment we denied those limits and exploited natural resources for our own use without acknowledging any natural limits. Laszlo claims that the situation has changed radically, and, quote, "finding and respecting these limits is precisely the problem facing us today," unquote. Laszlo points out that all of our activity is goal-driven, hence value-laden. So, quote, "each of us must, in the sense that he cannot help but, commit himself to survival, creativity, and mutual adaptation within a society of his peers. The alternative to these is isolation and death," unquote. In this process of creating lives and societies that are most likely to lead to a complex set of natural and cultural systems that are integrated together, the uniquely human power of soul we use is what Laszlo calls, quote, "reflective consciousness." Laszlo defines this as, quote, "the ability not only to perceive and feel things, but to know that one perceives and feels them," unquote. With this power we can re-examine the habits we grew up with and compare them to our scientific knowledge and the model of reality as a series of systems. Instead of reacting to what the people around us are doing, instead of adapting to the behaviors, hence the values, of our ancestors, we can create a set of new values that are more likely to lead to flourishing in the future. Laszlo distinguishes between descriptive values, the goals we observe people working toward, and normative values. Quote, "normative values or value norms are things we discover by examining human characteristics and pointing to those values which could lead people to fulfillment. Hence, normative values are not described but postulated. They are creations of the inquiring intellect, but they're not arbitrary," unquote. The goal of normative values is to create cultural systems that promote what Laszlo calls fulfillment, but which could also be called flourishing. Laszlo links his view of human flourishing to his description of the broader systems model. Quote, "fulfillment means the realization of human potentials for existence as a biological and as a socio-cultural being. It means bodily as well as mental health. It means adaptation to the environment as a biological organism constituting an irreducible whole of its parts, and as a socio-cultural role carrier collaboratively constituting the multi-person systems in his or her society," unquote. Laszlo also connects his view to a long intellectual tradition of humanism. All types of humanism focus on the value of promoting human flourishing. Systems thinkers have the same goal, but they define the goal differently. Quote, "Our humanistic goal is to enhance individual fulfillment in an increasingly deterministic, multi-leveled society composed of greatly differentiated individuals." Unquote. The system's view of humanism rejects moral relativism and claims that societies can be analyzed according to whether, as systems, they promote human flourishing. Further, for better or worse, all cultural systems are directed toward human flourishing, even though they're not all designed to achieve that goal because of the power of human choice. In order to create or change a cultural systems thinkers point out that the natural world provides guidelines. Quote, humanistic norms are not arbitrary. They are coded in every natural system. Unquote. If we want to promote human flourishing, the cultures we create must be integrated with the humanistic norms that exist in the natural systems out of which they emerged. Finally, Laszlo makes the connection between the system's view of humanism and Aristotle's view. Quote, "What are intrinsic human norms? The Greeks had an answer. They said that the end of the good life is happiness. Happiness, Aristotle specified, is the fulfillment of that which is specifically human in us. Self-fulfillment, as contemporary humanistic thinkers and psychologists acknowledge, is the end of human purposeful behavior. It is the actualization of potentials inherent in all of us. The potentials inherent in all of us, then, are those humanistic norms that are encoded in every natural system." Unquote. Further, the United Nations Capabilities Model also includes the relation between culture and nature. The eighth capability is being able to live with concern for and in relation to animals, plants, and the world of nature. We have evolved within a natural context, and we can only develop our natural capabilities within the context of allowing the natural world and its systems to thrive also. To conclude this section, systems thinkers, Aristotle, and the United Nations have a very similar model of the capabilities or potentialities of the human soul. They all recognize a natural context within which those capabilities first evolved, and the need to structure our cultures to be integrated within the complex network of non-human natural systems, if we are going to actualize human potentials, and, at this point in history, if we and the other natural systems are even going to survive. Next section, moral relativism, systems thinking, and reflective consciousness. Where is the primary disagreement between Benedict and Laszlo? How did the two views diverge to such a large extent? The key here is Laszlo's emphasis on the human power of reflective self-consciousness. For Laszlo, the unique human power of reflective consciousness is the power that enables us to detach ourselves from our immediate surroundings, to study the patterns in nature and culture, and to recommend normative values according to which we should guide cultural change. The United Nations, Aristotle, and all humanistic traditions also either argue for or presuppose our capacity to engage in such reflection and use it to guide behavior. Laszlo explains how this uniquely human power is the result of a natural evolutionary process. The natural foundation for this level of consciousness was the evolution of the nervous system, first at a more rudimentary level and then at a more complex level in human beings. Quote, "There are good reasons to correlate self-awareness with certain varieties of highly integrated nervous functions performed only by the most evolved nervous systems." Unquote. A complex nervous system enables us to detach ourselves from our immediate sensory stimulus and create alternative images or models of our world. Quote, "Organisms endowed with reflective consciousness are liberated from the world of concrete here and now experience and can enter a quasi-autonomous world of their own creation." unquote. The ability to create alternative so-called worlds is linked to the ability to resist an immediate response to sensory stimuli in favor of behaving according to the alternative world. The cerebral cortex of the human brain does the job of, quote, monitoring the performance of other systems and setting it right when needed, unquote. This more complex way of living enabled our ancestors to survive more effectively because they could move from immediate experience to the recognition of patterns in experience, leading to the ability to anticipate the future and act in ways that would achieve their goals based on what they learned from their experience. Quote, our ancestors exploded the limits of genetically programmed behavior. They learned to learn from experience. By reflecting on the events of a hunt, for example, they could abstract its relevant elements and compare them with other occasions. They could select the most successful pattern of behavior and adopt it. Again, you should remember Benedict has a very different description of tribes and he's describing way before the tribes that are alive today. The activity of reflection occurs in the cerebral cortex and is possible because of the evolution of our complex nervous system. Laszlo's description includes the notions of some kind of cultural selection and of adaptation. It's clear from this description that the culture is adapting to its circumstances in a way that promotes flourishing. Citizens are being molded to select for those behaviors that are most likely to lead to survival and well-being, based on the patterns that their reflective consciousness has passed down from one generation to the next. The process is not arbitrary or the result of accidents. Whether or not anyone or everyone is conscious that he's engaging in this process, the process itself of recognizing patterns requires the use of many higher order powers that belong only to the human psyche. Laszlo goes on. The next step in the development of consciousness, directly related to pattern recognition, is the development of language. Quote, it is relatively easy to tell whether an organism possesses reflective consciousness by noting whether it has developed a language and other symbolic modes of expression and communication, and whether it can transcend the limits of the here and now by making plans not directly triggered by active stimuli. Man alone passes this test. Laszlo describes the development of more and more complex systems of language, which lead to more and more complex social systems. Quote, human language, in using denotative symbols rather than expressive signs, became an effective instrument for communicating meaning. It enabled our ancestors not only to survive, but to dominate their world. Existence became social existence within the context of a common set of meanings, communicated by means of a common language. Culture was born, and elaborate forms of social organization created. We became a socio-cultural animal. Over a long period of time, quote, the brunt of the responsibility for survival rested on abstract mental processes, that is, on intelligence, unquote. This process continues today. Each generation is born into a more complex network of social systems, linked in more and more complex ways with natural systems. Each generation has to find out what cultural norms are most likely to lead the human flourishing for the next generation and create normative values that describe what behaviors we must select for in order to adapt to the changing circumstances. The creation of culture goes way beyond mere survival. Laszlo explains, quote, culture is more than a tool of human survival. It's a qualitatively higher phenomenon. Thinking rationally and feeling with clarity and intensity, coupled perhaps with faith and a conscious morality, is qualitatively different from behaviors to assure one's survival and the continuity of the species. Culture and survival functions must not be confused. Unquote. This qualitative difference does not make every society good simply because the citizens are all engaged in activities they think will lead to their goal of flourishing. What they do is what they value and what they call good. More complex societies are not better than less complex ones simply because they have more people or more people engaged in higher order cultural activities. Societies can be evaluated as better or worse according to whether the behaviors selected for lead to what everyone really wants, the best possible adaptation between nature and culture and between the systems within a culture. Laszlo points out that one criteria, the current generation, although it is the most complex, might be the worst because of its inability to adapt to the natural systems. Our capacity for reflective consciousness forces us to continually choose between alternative normative values, or we must continually create and recreate our cultures. Quote, our evolutionary history determined that we become a cultural creature, but did not determine what kind of culture we would have. Hence, our problem today is not whether to have a culture, it is what kind of a culture to have. And this requires some serious thought. The kind of culture we inherited from our fathers and grandfathers is beginning to challenge our ability to survive on this planet. If we do nothing more than blindly accept it, we may not have the grandchildren to hand it down to. Unquote. On Laszlo's view, then, reflective consciousness is what defines us and distinguishes us from all other creatures or beings in the universe. It can be used to enable us to thrive, or we can abuse it and destroy ourselves and the natural systems around us. Reflective consciousness evolved long ago and was the power that gave us the ability to survive and then to thrive. And the third section of this paper will be comparing Laszlo's view with Benedict.